Hi, this is Steve Long. I'm officially the Carrie M. McGuire University Professor of Ethics at Southern Methodist University. I was baptized by the Anabaptists, educated by the Evangelicals, and went to seminary with liberal Protestants. My first job was with the Jesuits. They were the only ones who would hire me, which means that I'm pretty much theologically confused and ecumenically inclined. And I'm glad to be here with you today.
Thanks, Steve. It's wonderful to be with you as well. And I can relate to you admitting to being theologically confused because Bill is really confused about Jesus. I mean, he's got this crazy idea that Jesus is somehow this 1960s American guy that's a hippie. And I just can't convince him that it's true. So I'm going to let you give it a shot.
Bill, you may not be far wrong, but here's my concern. I lived through the 60s, and most of the hippies that I knew in the 60s are now financial investment bankers or lawyers. So I don't know. I don't know if hippies, if Jesus were a hippie, what would he be today? So that's my concern. I'm just not sure that being a hippie has the longevity to it, the staying power. So I don't know. I don't know if I go with Jesus being a hippie.
Well, yeah, but Jesus only had to worry about 33 years, though.
Yeah, I guess that's right. Well, really 3 years, once he starts his ministry.
Right. Well, we are excited to have you here. And one of the things we love to hear from people is to hear a story of some kind. It could be a true story, a story from the Bible. It could even be a story about a geeky guy named Jeremy who's really grumpy that explains your understanding of Jesus.
The best story I have from my understanding of Jesus would be my old college roommate who embodied Christ's presence to me in a lot of ways. I had a major back surgery when I was in college, and I had a cast, and I couldn't even bend over and tie my shoes. And he was studying for the ministry, so he didn't have to get up very early. All his classes were later in the day. I was studying chemistry and had early morning classes. And he would set his alarm, get up, and make sure that my shoes were tied since I couldn't tie them every morning. So he has always embodied for me a living example of what Jesus is supposed to be.
Wow, that's a really great story and a very dedicated roommate. He does embody Jesus for us.
Yeah, it's actually true too. I sometimes think that he's been the practitioner over the years. He's worked with a ministry of gangs for years. He's a practitioner, and I became the theoretician.
Well, that's awesome. We're excited to have you on because you have a book that's just about to be released. And the title is just really fascinating and the subject caught our attention. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this book that's coming out, I think, the same week as this podcast, and a little bit about maybe what inspired you to write it.
I will. I was invited to write this book by Kathy Armistead at the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry. She had read a few things that I had done on the current political situation and the difficulty with truth that it seems to have generated. And she asked me if I'd write a book, if I'd put a book together. And I'd written a book already, a complicated book for philosophy and theology called Speaking of Truth. And nobody read that book. My mom didn't even read that book. It was a complete failure, that book. But I put a lot of work into it. So I'd done a book already on truth. But Kathy asked me to do something more popular, more at the level of like a Sunday school class or an audience in the church. And first I said, I'm working on something else. I really shouldn't do it. But then I thought, as a Methodist elder, I felt obligated. The church finally asked me to do something. I should do it. So I set everything aside and started working on it. And it just came together very quickly. She was quite pleased with it. The General Board's done a great deal in their Foundry book series to advertise it. But the genesis of the book is really just the kind of nihilism, the loss of truth that has taken over clearly Washington, D.C., but even our culture in general, where telling the truth is no longer considered to be a political event. The purpose of the book is trying to bring back the claim that the truth will set you free. You may have heard of that, the truth will set you free.
Once or twice.
Yeah, that was spoken by the hippie Jesus. And it's actually the motto where I work at Southern Methodist University. They put it in Latin, of course, Veritatis Liberabit Vas. I just wonder if it's true. Will the truth set us free? And in a lot of ways, this book is a long, long discussion on that claim that Jesus makes before in the Gospel of John, and then of course claiming to be truth before Pilate, who says, "What is truth?" which seems to win politically these days.
Well, I understand why Perkins put that in Latin, because it's not academic unless it's in Latin, obviously. But
yeah.
And I also really, both Jeremy and I understand about, something failing and not even your mom listening. We only have my mom and my 6 sisters that listen, so it's one of those things where we feel your pain.
Yeah. Right. Well, I come from a big family. We just had a family reunion, so I'll send out a note and see if we can't get a few of them to listen as well.
Well, that'll be awesome. That'll like triple our listening. I noticed as I was reading this, as you talked, you wanted to make sure that we understood that this post-truth society that we're in now didn't begin with Donald Trump. It's just exemplified and just really come to the forefront now. It's been a problem for centuries, but why is it important to tackle the issue right now as opposed to 10 years ago?
Yeah, that's a great question. In one sense, I don't think it is. And a lot of us were tackling the issue 10 years ago, been tackling the issue for a century, if not longer. I do think that right now there's actually an opportune moment because, if you look at Bill Clinton was such a good liar. He lied well. I never knew if he was telling me the truth. I wanted to believe him. But Trump, his lies are so obvious, the deceit so manifest that no one can, you have to be really deluded to not know that he's lying to you. And it works for him. So I think it's a moment where the tradition of being susceptible to the lie has become so blatant that it's obvious. And that's a moment for us to take advantage of. And I think you're right. I think we would not take advantage of it well if we thought that Trump was unique. Trumpism isn't unique. It's a symptom. And part of what I wanted to do in this book is to ask, and it's not a book about Trump. There's enough books about Trump. There's you couldn't read them all at the beach in a week. There's so many. What I wanted to do with this book was to sort of diagnose theologically and philosophically, what are these trends? Where do they come from? How can we illumine these trends of being susceptible to the lie, which goes back right to the book of Genesis, for heaven's sakes, has been present in creation since the fall, however we understand it. The fall is about deceit. It is about being susceptible to the lie. This is the nature of human sin. It's wonderful that we can see it before us every day with such obviousness, so that perhaps we might construct a better account of what it means to be political.
I remember being at an ecumenical service right after a shooting at an African-American church. One of the speakers was talking about how in the 80s they had made this big arrest and he thought he had defeated racism once and for all. Right. But he had come to understand that racism was a battle that each generation has to fight. And as you talk about like truth and lie, it seems to me that it's not a once and for all and we're finally going to get it right this time, but a battle that each generation has to fight, or maybe we have to fight within ourselves each day.
I think that's exactly right. And a part of what I wanted to raise in this book was how, the deceits coming from the White House and the people who enable this White House, they have to own that. They're accountable for it. I don't want to have any kind of false equivalency. However, I think it is a moment when we each ask ourselves, how are we complicit in the construction of a culture, of politics, a society that works so well with the lie? St. Augustine argued that it was that the lie was precisely what generated a corrupt politics. That any politics that couldn't tell the truth about itself, was incapable of being truly political. That's what the city of God was supposed to be, a place where you could tell the truth. So he begins his confessions with this wonderful line, "For the sake of your love, I will retrace my wicked ways." In other words, He's so confident in God's love that he can look at himself and tell the truth about who he is. I think that's really hard to do, but that's something that is necessary.
Just a moment ago, you mentioned the difference between the way Bill Clinton lies and the way that Donald Trump lies. And that sparked an interesting question in my mind. Which would be better, to have an obvious liar in power or a good liar in power?
Right. I think that's a great question, too. In one sense, I think there's pros and cons. It'd be better to have someone who knew the truth in power, quite frankly. I'm still waiting for Plato's Philosopher King, where power is in service to what's true and what's good. I think that's worthwhile. And actually, I think that's what we have in Jesus. We have a king who, in fact, tells us the truth. And we don't like the truth. We don't often want to see the truth. We certainly don't want to see the truth of God in a cross. But I think we do have in Jesus exactly what Plato hoped for, but has very seldom materialized. I think it is possible. It is possible for there to be truth-telling in politics. It's rare, but it's possible. With Clinton, you had someone good at deception, and that meant you could easily be taken in. But he wasn't as brazen in the kind of nihilistic power that we find in someone like Trump, who in one sense might not even be a liar. Harry Frankfurt had that great book, he's a philosopher, had that great book called On Bullshit. And he says there's a difference between a bullshitter and a liar, that a liar actually has to act as if he knows the truth and is presenting you the truth. Whereas someone who's just BSing all the time, they just don't think there is anything such as truth. So, what is simply what the one in power says it is. I think that's also dangerous, incredibly dangerous. It's why someone like Trump can make one claim and then 5 minutes later making the contradictory claim and not seem to have any moral compunction about it. So yeah, they both are troubling, but it is part of it's part of the role of the democratic populace to keep power accountable to truth, or at least to try to do so. And I think that should be the work of the church. Right now, that should be the work of the church. And it's disappointing that the church has not been bolder in fulfilling that task.
It reminds me, you made that claim, you kind of talk about a post-truth world in the book, that somehow, and maybe that's the difference between a liar and a bullshitter. We've come to a stage where we're questioning, is there truth, or is it just what the people in power say? So maybe say a little bit about what you mean by a post-truth world, and then if you could wrap back around and land on your last point about what the church can do specifically to say that we know the truth and this truth can set us free.
I think a post-truth world is developing in a new way, largely because of big data. And what we have now are professional pollsters who will tell you how framing certain things will affect, manipulate, land with the masses. So rather than asking questions of the truth, what we like is amassing data in terms of opinion and manipulating that opinion for the ends of the service of power. Even think about I don't know if you watched the Democratic debate on CNN. To me, it was just a clear example of kind of post-truth politics. There was really not much that you learned. What we were looking for was a cage match, kind of personality types and how they clashed. Think about how different it would be if they were sitting around a table and people were actually talking about healthcare, and we had people there who weren't just politicians, but also people who had studied this and knew what it would cost and how we might do it, and we're trying to work together for a common good, and we all realize we want all of our neighbors to be able to have affordable health care. That's our goal. We started there, and then we had a truthful discussion about how do we achieve this. But we never get to that because we're in a post-truth politics where the whole point is to manipulate, to gain power. Mitch McConnell is the perfect example of this. Who knows what he stands for? He stands for power, clearly. But it's not clear to me that the other side is always much different. So post-truth politics would argue that truth has no significant role in our political discussion, nor for that matter does what is good. So that I don't mean to romanticize the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages had their problems too, but in the Middle Ages, the true, the good, and the beautiful were necessary to make sense of everyday life. That's why we have beautiful cathedrals. We don't have beautiful cathedrals. We have Walmart. We have, big box stores. And nobody goes there because they're beautiful. We've lost that sense of beauty. We've lost the sense of a common quest for the good. We've lost the truth because, quite frankly, I think most of our neighbors simply don't think those things exist. And if they don't exist, what does? Well, it's power, manipulation, but in service to what? And I don't think most of our politicians couldn't answer that. In service to nothing.
It reminds me of, I guess about a month ago, we had Rebecca Miles on, and we were talking or lamenting the tendency to talk past each other and try to make points instead of honestly debating things. And it seems to me that goes hand in hand with truth, that we're not discussing with each other. We're not interested in the truth because we're not actually trying to work anything out. We're just trying to make my point or win an argument.
Yes, exactly. And truth is tricky. Don't get me wrong. I mean, and in the book, I talk a great deal about how tricky truth can be. Truth is complicated. It's complex. There are some things that are true, that are simple. Euripides wrote some plays, and we could identify them. There are things that we could that are true, that are just sort of at a minimal level, should be unquestionable, incontrovertible. But then there are more difficult things, the things that matter. And I do think having a discussion about those things with the hope and even the expectation that we might come to some truth about them is what sets us free, even if we don't always find the truth. So, questions like, does God exist? I know not everybody comes to the same answer on that question as I do. There's not common agreement. But in the university, I think the fact that we can have an open and honest discussion about that without condemning one another makes the university a very interesting and unique place. I love the university when those kinds of things take place. But it doesn't always take place. And if we assume that there is no truth, then it seems like if we begin there is no truth. Then it's just going to be who yells the loudest. There's a moral philosophy called emotivism. And emotivism is a theory of moral meaning, which says something is good because I like it. That's what makes it good. It's a statement about my preferences. And you kind of see that with Facebook, where moral debate is reduced to, people gathering likes on their statements. But it's really not an argument. It's not a political conversation or a moral conversation.
Well, if the church is supposed to be a beacon of truth in our society, how is it that we can rectify passages in Scripture like the Jacob and Latham story, where Jacob seems to be held up and even admired for tricking Latham? I mean, that becomes a problem for the church, doesn't it?
Yeah, that would be. I mean, I suppose the question is Jacob honored because of his ability to manipulate, or is it because he has a kind of prudence? There is a prudence, which is a wisdom, which is something other than just being the trickster. But Jacob does seem to be a trickster, and it also seems to get him in trouble. So I assume every exemplar in Scripture is not there to be emulated. Sometimes the exemplars are there precisely because they generate questions. Sometimes I think that way about Jacob. And in the end, I would read Scripture Christologically. And the Gospel of John, I think, is the Gospel of John is almost like a midrash on the commandment not to lie. And that is one of the commands.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. It's a good question.
Yeah.
I'll have to think about it. I never thought about that till just this minute.
Well, I'm glad we could bring up an ethical dilemma for you. But
Hang on. Let's just pause and just note that his guest just said, "Good question, Bill."
Yeah.
That has never happened before.
Steve, can you take a moment and you bring up truth and value? Can you talk a little bit about truth versus value?
Value is also a tricky word. Stanley Hauerwas, who I studied with, used to always say, used cars have values. People should never have values. Don't have values. And what he meant by that, and that's a typical Hauerwasianism. I think what he meant by that is values. What gives something a value in our society is preference. So if enough people want it, then it's going to have a certain value. Now, I assume values, what you mean by values is something other than that. Values is something like virtue. Virtues are those qualities of character that help us sustain everyday life. I think they're inevitable. In fact, I think truth is more basic than lie. You can't sustain a political society on the lie. Eventually, it will do itself in because creation is good. And if there is by the good, that would be for me the quintessential value, the foundation of the moral life. Creation is good. If you treat it as if it's only evil, if you treat creation as if lies are going to be more productive and powerful than the truth, then I think inevitably you're pushing against the good order of creation, and that will bring its own collapse at some point. It could be that we're seeing that now in the U.S. with the imperial decline that we're living through.
I'm sorry. Actually, what I meant by truth versus value, you talk in your book about a statement that Marco Rubio makes about we need more plumbers not plumbers, but welders, could be either one, than philosophers, because welders make money. And you refer to that because we see the welder making money have value.
Yeah, right. Okay, good. Yeah, actually, we're on the same page there. Okay. Yeah, value there becomes quantifiable. And Trump has made similar kinds of claims. You might remember, I think it was in a rally in Minnesota when he says, "Why am I not part of the elite? I have a bigger home than them. I have a larger salary than they do." As if these kind of quantifiable things, how much money you have or how much money you make, determines value. I think most of us, would deny that. You'd have to be a very shallow human being to think that in the end, all that matters is your 401k, or all that matters is the size of your penthouse. That's why one of the things that I used in this book was the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, which I think depicts the logical outcome of that way of thinking, which is the true story of Jordan Belfort, who found a way to make money and treated everything, even his family and children, as if they were those kinds of consumable items that he accrued to sort of increase his portfolio. And it all came crashing down. I think we should be very careful about that. It's dangerous.
Yeah, isn't that part of the church's role, is to say that is not the answer, or the value of human lives is not quantifiable by the size of your 401k? That's part of our role as a church, right? To proclaim this. Yeah,
and to call those of us who think that way to repentance again and again and again, because it's easy to get sucked into that. So I think one of the reasons the church can tell the truth, or should be able to tell the truth, in a way that the rest of society doesn't, is that in every service we have this moment where we say, confess your sins, known and unknown. Think about your life. Think about how it's caught up in things that don't order you towards God. They don't order you towards what is good or true. Think about how you become susceptible to the lie. One of the things you see in Trumpist populism, with its whataboutism and look over there, not here, is this constant, incessant movement. I mean, Trump is very good about sort of setting the agenda by pointing to something or generating something, and moving on with such rapidity that you never have a chance to take a breath. You never have a chance to reflect, to contemplate. So I do think that the church should be a place where, in silence, we can hear the Spirit remind us of our own failures. And that can be very freeing, to know the truth about yourself and not allow that truth to destroy you. That's what St. Augustine did in his Confessions. The truth about me won't destroy me because I am confident in God's love.
Yeah, that's exactly it. As you were telling about the Wolf of Wall Street, it occurred to me, the lectionary text, I think last week, was the story of the guy who had an abundant harvest, and he's like, I'll just tear my barns down and build bigger ones. And Jesus takes him to task for that. And that is America. It is like 21st century capitalist America. You know, we all have, on some level, a bigger barn mentality.
Right. Secure the borders. Secure your 401k. Secure the stock market. It's all about security. And it generates a politics of fear. We're afraid of everything. I mean, it just strikes me as odd that this country, which is so powerful, is just ruled with such fear all the time. And part of it's because we don't really want to look at who we are. I just got back from Berlin. I spent 9 days with my granddaughter and son-in-law and daughter in Germany. And I was really moved. My son-in-law's parents were Jewish, and they had to flee Germany in the 40s. So I went back with their family, and we visited some of the places they're from. And what struck me about Germany is they want to remember the past, not for the sake of profit or gain. Most of the museums that remember it are free, but so that they'll know how to navigate into the future. And I don't think we've wanted to do that. I mean, I grew up 10 miles from Marion, Indiana, where one of the last lynchings in America happened in the 1930s. You know, there are people still who were born then. The last generation's coming, or that we're losing that last generation. But we don't want to remember. We don't want to look at those things. And I think that's part of this fear, because we're afraid if we look at them, it might just undo us. We don't have the strength to look at who we were. And I think that's one of the reasons we continue to repeat these patterns that rebirth this nation. And I use that term intentionally. We have this tendency to in every generation, rebirth the nation of America in the moment as if it had no history. So we don't have to remember this history, the things that continue to form us as a people. It was D.W. Griffiths, thanks. D.W. Griffiths' film. He was raised Methodist, and he was the inventor of the cinema in the United States, and he did it by creating the most racist film to bring the South and the North together at the expense of African Americans. You know, everybody should have to see that film. In one sense, what's going on in Trumpian populism is another rendition of Griffith's The Birth of a Nation.
Hey, this is Kenneth Wilson, the music guy behind the Happy Hippie Jesus Show. If you like what you're hearing, go to Apple Podcasts and rate the show 5 stars. If you don't rate it 5 stars, Jesus will know.
Thomas Aquinas said that fear is such a powerful emotion that once it takes hold in a human, it pushes the compassion right out of us. And that's the kind of power fear has. What kind of power does truth-telling have as opposed to alternative facts and lying?
I think telling the truth can only occur when you've overcome fear. Because you can't tell the truth if you're so moved and motivated by fear, because fear does not allow you to see the world properly. Everyone becomes a potential terrorist. Everyone becomes someone who threatens me. And that's why you've got to walk around with an AK-47. Everyone's a potential enemy. No one can really live that way, because if that was the case, society would just, completely fall apart. It would be what Hobbes thought society was, a war of all against all. I don't think that's how God's good creation works. So the first thing that telling the truth does is it does away with the politics of fear. You can't tell the truth and have a politics of fear. Those two things are incompatible. The other thing that I think telling the truth does is telling the truth must be in service to love. Here I think of Benedict XVI's encyclical Caritas in Veritate. It's not just telling the truth. Sometimes telling the truth can be a weapon. It can get weaponized, like the First Amendment or anything that can be weaponized. Truth-telling can be weaponized where you do it simply for the sake of exposing, manipulating, gaining power over others. So I do think that another kind of crucial virtue that has to be in play here is the virtue of charity, love, that infused virtue, or theological virtue, as they say, as the tradition has put it. So telling the truth should be in service to love. And if it's not, then it can quickly dissipate into something other than the virtue of truth-telling.
Let's move away from politics and into the church. This is the Happy Hippie Jesus Show, right? So what kind of role should the church play in moving us out of a post-truth world and into, or returning to, the truth shall set you free?
Well, the first thing is, I think the church should be the place where we can have these kinds of uncomfortable conversations. After Trump was elected, and I realized, I'm from the Midwest, I'm from Indiana, I grew up there, and I realized that family members, distant family members, had a politics that I didn't quite understand. I thought, well, we should have an open conversation about this at a family gathering. And I suggested that. And people weren't too happy about that. They were rather alarmed. In fact, I was asked not to raise this at the family gathering because it would be too divisive. People could wear a MAGA hat or, a Bernie hat, but they didn't want to talk about it. And I thought, well, you can't have politics if people can't sit around the kitchen table and talk about these differences without killing each other or, falling out with each other. So where can we do that? I think that's a really important practice that has to be cultivated, especially in the life of the church. We know we have disagreements in the church. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but can we discuss them? Can the church be a place where we have a conversation about what a good life is? The church should be a place where we talk about health care, where we talk about the use of violence, where we talk about economics, where perhaps we confess to each other how much we make. Those of us who are Methodist pastors have to publish every year our salary, which I think is a wonderful thing, and anybody can have access to it. It'd be wonderful if the church was the kind of place where those sorts of things could occur. I think what prevents that is the idea that the church is primarily a warehouse for individual souls to be saved, which of course is not the Christian doctrine of salvation. God's created a new heaven and earth and bringing them together, which God does first and foremost in the incarnation in Jesus, who is divinity and humanity reconciled at one in one acting person, and we can participate in his life. I don't know how we generate those kinds of spaces in the life of the church. And yet I think they'd be less strange there than in a lot of other places. So I think the church has a lot of potential to really be political in the best sense of the word, not in the manipulative sense. When people say, well, how will this play politically? They don't mean, well, how will this help us serve the ends of truth and goodness? They mean, what will popular opinion think about it? We have to move away from politics as popular opinion and think of politics as this striving for the truth in service to the good.
Maybe in part of that, it occurs to me, we have to arrive at a place where it's okay to disagree or okay to say we're not going to arrive at some objective sense of what the truth is. I mean, if the object, and I think a lot of people, and in my own mind, I'm guilty of doing this sometimes, we confuse the idea of truth with being right or arriving at an objective answer. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it's possible for us to arrive at an objective answer about guns or healthcare or taxes or, any number of issues. because we all bring different perspectives and knowledge to that situation. But there's benefit in having conversations, and maybe we can move ourselves forward that way.
Yeah, I wouldn't preclude the possibility that we arrive at some, I don't know about objective, but that we arrive at some concrete judgments. I think we can. I think we have. I mean, nobody in our churches today would advocate slavery, even though we know there's still, way too many people enslaved throughout the world. But, we no longer advocate for that. That's a good thing. And if somebody did say, let's reconsider slavery, I think we'd say, no, that's corrupt. We don't want to have a conversation with you. So I don't have dialogue for the sake of dialogue, or conversation for the sake of conversation. I think we want to assume that we might, should. I mean, I grew up in rural Indiana. I had my first gun at the age of 12. And I know, I went to the NRA gun safety classes through the Boy Scouts when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I understand that culture. And yet I think we should have some really good discussions about what are the purposes of guns? Should Christians bring guns to church? I mean, I think that's a really important question. And I think we might be able to, if not get an answer, at least set some parameters within which one could think rightly about this.
I think that's fair.
Yeah, it's fair. Quite honestly, there are Christians in my congregation that I am more comfortable with them bringing guns to worship than others. Just because I know their background and I know how they treat firearms.
And that's all, I guess, relative. It would never occur to any of us to tell a policeman that comes to church in his uniform because he was on duty or just got off duty to leave his gun in the parking lot or something. We'd be like, that's part of what he is, and that's part of his job right now.
Well, it's interesting. I do know some churches that do ask that very thing.
Okay.
And simply because when you come there as a baptized member of the body, what does it mean? What are you leaving behind? Every gathering of the church is also a mini Exodus. What do we all leave behind when we walk through those doors? Which, church doors should be painted red because they remind us of the blood of Christ that renews us. When we walk into the doors, that there are things we all need to shed. And I'm not saying that you have to shed being a police officer per se, but your vocation, what is your vocation within that place? How does it change? How does it shift?
That is an interesting question for all of us to answer. And maybe one that would bring us to a better place as a church and a nation.
Do you think we could, and here's my question about, a church would be free that could have that question, that could ask that question and have an honest conversation about it. Yeah. That would mean that church is free. If they do it in terms of scripture and tradition, not just emotivism. If it divulges into emotivism, to me, that's when you can't have an honest political discussion, because then everybody's feelings are just legitimate. Each individual's feelings legitimate his or her ethical actions. And that, I think, is where we are, and I think that's deeply problematic.
We have taken up a lot of your time, and we appreciate it. This has been like one of those discussions where we realize that we've got a long way to go, and and that maybe Jeremy and I might need to go back to seminary. But we like to end our shows with this question. What is it that's saving your soul right now? And Jesus is a given.
Oh, darn. You took my answer. Like that old children's sermon where the preacher asks, what's brown, furry, and runs up and down trees, and the kid says, well, I think it's a squirrel, but I know the answer is always Jesus. What saves my soul right now? I have hope, and I think the hope is found in my conviction that it's God who brings about the new creation, even when I can't see it, and I'm so tempted towards despair, and I have been very tempted towards despair the last few years. especially as you think about all that we're up against: climate change, the refugee crisis. The United Nations just put out a report about food shortages, which are going to exacerbate all these things. Just the anger and the violence that's prevalent in our culture right now. All of that tempts me to despair, but despair is a sin against the Holy Spirit, so I simply can't afford myself the luxury of despair. And I think what sustains me is the reminder that it's not up to us to bring about the proper political order. If I thought it was, I would be in despair. But that, in fact, it is God who brings that about. And what we do is we try to participate in what God is bringing about wherever we see it in everyday life, and trying to find those places, those glimpses of space. And let me just conclude with this story. I have a granddaughter who's about a year and a half, and we were in a museum in Berlin. It's called the Topographies of Terror, about how young men had got caught up in the Nazis. And it was just story after story after story of everyday people who wound up killing their neighbors in this wanton manner. It was real somber, and everybody was walking through it quietly. She was there, and being 1.5, she had no idea that she was supposed to be somber. So she's laughing and carrying on and making all kinds of noise. And at first I thought, oh no, she should be quiet. But then I thought, no, that's the appropriate response. Those Nazis wanted to do away with her life by destroying her great-grandfather. But they did not succeed. And she's here. And her laughter to me was just the laughter of the divine in the face of the evil. I keep thinking of moments like that remind me it's not up to me. I don't have to figure it out. I have to participate in what God will bring about when God creates the new heaven and new earth.
Thank you for sharing that story. That was really great. Bill, because he does all the work around here, will put links to your book and everything in the show notes. Is there any way that people can find you or contact you if they want to know more about your project or any projects that you have going on that you want to mention? Yes, indeed. I have a website at Southern Methodist University in the McGuire Chair, and all you have to do is Google it and you'd find it. And it has my current projects and a list of works that I've done, and also my email. I'm always glad to entertain questions, comments, even challenges. I appreciate them and find them clarifying. And I very much appreciate you fellas inviting me to be part of your podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.